right, can I be seen and heard by everyone?
Yep, both.
What's the POI thing?
The POI thing?
There's one team online. Do you just want to look at the chat? Keep it on the chat?
Yeah, that's my intention.
Or we could just ask them to yell out the POIs.
No, but the thing is, even though it doesn't interrupt us, it interrupts the adjudicators because the sound just becomes
Right.
Yeah.
like when they say point, like Jordyn speaking.
Yeah, exactly. It's hard to
So
see if
it's
you're
better if
judging.
they just go for a chat.
Yeah.
And you just-
Sorry, Amrit, and also opening opposition. Just to be super clear, if you want to ask a POI, oh no, Amrit can't ask a POI to me anyway. But opening opposition, if you'd like to ask a POI, please just post it in the chat. At some point during the speech, I do intend to probably just ask for one from someone. We'll see how my mood is. So expect that. Awesome. Okay, so let's get started. Corporations did not always used to be as ruthless and as destructive as they are now. In the 70s, in the 60s, and in the 50s, there were far better conditions for workers. There were things like upward mobility. Communities were more likely to be protected. The reason that things changed is because fiduciary duties were imposed that meant that companies had an obligation only to their shareholders, which is why this type of imposition of stakeholder prioritization is actually not so different from the status quo. But what it really is it is adding people other than just the shareholders who have to be considered. And that is the burden that opposition teams have to grapple with in this debate, is they don't have to defend, like they have to defend why it is that shareholders are somehow more important than community, or than to the community, than the environment, than labor organizations and labor forces, to the point that we should only prioritize shareholders, which means that I'm very much looking forward to understanding why it is that those shareholders have positive incentives. I will tell you that their incentives are profoundly negative and short-termist, and why it is that they are somehow more important than the very employees of the company, the very environment that the company depends on to exist. Looking forward to that. Note that what happened in the 70s is that shareholders started to aggressively sue companies that were underperforming as they saw it. That didn't necessarily mean that companies weren't doing things that made sense commercially. What it meant was that those companies were deprioritizing shareholders and instead returning profits to their workers, or meant that companies were maybe taking longer term views on the sustainability of the resources that they used. So for example, that could look like companies saying, hey, yeah, there are a bunch of trees that are already grown out there that we could log right now. Or what we could do is invest in things like creating a plantation that will ensure that we have a sustainable supply of lumber for 100 years. And so what shareholders were able to do is it only took a single shareholder to sue that company on a breach of its fiduciary obligation to the shareholders alone, and to say in court that that meant that the company had to aggressively prioritize those shareholder interests. And those shareholder interests were ones that were negative. They're ones that were profoundly short-termist, because shareholders will often only hold a stock for a few months, for a few years. They don't have any stake in whether that company is sustainable in 100 years or in 200 years, nor do they have any stake in whether the community that that company operates in is one that can produce future good companies either, which meant that their incentives were extraordinarily narrow and extraordinarily detrimental. That meant that if a company did something like offer above minimum wages to its entry-level workers, the company did not have a defense when shareholders said that extra money should be going to us instead, which was incredibly negative. And that is why you saw that corporate revolution in the 70s, and why you saw companies begin to behave in ways that were substantially more evil. A quick point of clarification: because of the importance that we think these companies have over communities, over labor, etc., we would be imposing this on every company that is not a small business, and even some small businesses, to the extent that they are maybe relatively important in the community, to the extent that they maybe have large labor forces, etc. We would also impose this obligation on, be left up to courts to decide largely. But certainly any company that is not considered a small business clearly falls into this debate, and that's probably where the majority of it takes place. Let's firstly talk about why this is principally justified. The first principle in this debate is why it is that communities are so impacted that they ought to have some level of protection against the actions of these companies. Note that this type of imposition really looks like companies using it as a defense in a fiduciary duty suit, right? This looks like a shareholder saying to a company, why are you paying your workers above minimum wage? It doesn't make sense. That money should go to me because you are the one that my obligation is owed to. And the company now under our side is able to say, the reason that I'm doing this is because employees are also a stakeholder I must prioritize. And also, likely, if that company wants to get future people to invest in it or future funding from banks, etc., it will also have to make, obviously, a commercial argument. And the commercial argument is likely to be something along the lines of, we think it makes sense long-term to treat our workers better than others. That means we get top talent. It means we get better retention. It means that those workers are more likely to be effective at work because they're able to do things like afford better food, spend more hours sleeping, etc., etc. So all of this is not to say that companies will suddenly sacrifice their commercial efficacy. It is about them being able to better be commercially efficacious by prioritizing those other stakeholders that are obviously important to the company's function. But what we would say more compellingly, I think, is that things like the labor forces of these companies, the environment, the community, the public resources that they use, etc., mean that the community and the other stakeholders in this are so affected by that company's organizations that you can easily analogize that company's power over them to something like, at minimum, a local council, but probably more likely a state or federal government, right? For most employees, their boss is far more important in their life than the government ever will be, because governments are often hands-off. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, especially in our world. But if you accept that if you have a degree of power over someone, that they should have protections over your exercise of that power, this is a fantastic way to do it, and a fantastic way to ensure that those communities that are impacted by these operations, those labor forces that are impacted, have recourse when it seems to be the case that the company is only prioritizing shareholders and fucking them over at the expense of those shareholders. The second obligation, the principle that we would provide, is the idea that because we give corporations protection that ordinary legal people do not, right? Like a corporation has far more protections and far more freedoms than I do, even though we are both legal people. And the reason for that is because we recognize that corporations can do these good things. They can be an effective way of doing things like producing utilities and producing wealth and resources for people. They are often better than the government at these things, or they would be under our side at least. And in return for us giving them things like the protection of limited liability, which means that owners of companies cannot be sued for the actions of their companies, surely we have a right to expect that those companies behave in at least minimally ethical ways when it comes to the treatment of their communities, when it comes to the treatment of the environment, when it comes to the treatment of their employees. I think that sort of protection and the other protections that we allow for companies, the fact that we allow them to do huge corporate donations, etc., all suggest that there's a reason to think that if we have decided as a society and as a government to allow corporations to exist and then to give them these special privileges and protections, we ought to expect them to use that enhanced power for societal good. And that is the underpinning principle of capitalism, right? It's the idea that these companies can do this well, can be a good force. And I think that this works with that very well. I'll take one for you guys.
Why can't you just look at consumer interest through class actions?
Through class actions, because often this is something that fills a necessary gap. You can't sue on behalf of the environment because the environment isn't a stakeholder right now. This adds that in. Similarly, you can't sue a company for just maximizing profit because legally right now that is what they have to do. This fills a necessary gap. It's not just about companies like actively hurting you by selling you, for example, lead contaminated milk or whatever. This is about companies treating you with a higher burden, a higher level of ethics. That was incredibly important. In the long term, we get companies that are more effective. They're able to be long-termist about the way that they practice their business because they're no longer liable to a shareholder who just wants to see this price of their stock go up in the next 2 years. Instead, a company can use this as a defense and say, no, we are going to do things like take on new environmentally friendly technology. We're going to move into a more sustainable business practice. We're going to stop using slave labor in the chocolate industry. All of these are things that we think are going to pay off for us, and we're going to see better profits as a result in 50 years and 20 years. And it's not okay to just prioritize our returns in the next 1 year or the next 2 years by behaving in the most exploitative way possible. You get a better world when you don't have these companies behaving because they're fearful that they're going to be sued by their shareholders every day. They're more effective. They're better for the communities. This is what would make capitalism actually work for people. And that's why we're so proud to propose.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for that speech. Now I'd like to welcome the Leader of Opposition. Here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yep.
Cool. Give me a minute while I stop my notes.
Let's just walk around about that.
Ah, okay, I'll just try my best. Cool. Yeah, let's go. Sorry, behind everyone. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Well, the presumed good of OG is that when you increase the ability of shareholders, like to be able to do stuff like for example, like make decisions for them, you magically get some form of benefit because everyone now cares about the slave trade in the chocolate factory, right? That now suddenly everyone cares about, oh no, now like what is going to happen in like the minimum wage worker. I'm going to split this into 3 people right now who are stakeholders in this debate. One, the average human person. So like your stock market human being who probably wants to put money inside to like get more returns and to stop, like for example, the scale of inflation, correct? Presumably this dude probably bought GameStop not because, wow, GameStop is really profitable, right? But because GameStop is something that got me money and got me some form of profit. I think that on scale, I think that the average stakeholder or the average human being who probably bought stocks within these areas are as short-termist as government terms them to be, and there's no analysis to prove why. I give you two. One, because the average stakeholder in this debate is not like your big corporations, right? And if they are, they already do have an incentive to continue to fund these corporations anyways, because your profits are tied to how well your company does, right? That when your Nintendo shares go up, for instance, that's when your company does well. Let's say, for example, if you're a hedge fund, right? Or let's say, for example, if you're a company that's funding Coca-Cola, for instance, if Coca-Cola starts to go down in shares, you also have an incentive to like keep these companies in check and balance already. So if you are not, this debate is not about big shareholders, right? But what about the average human person, right? I think one, they're probably as equally short-termist as they probably like came them out to be, because most people invest not because like it is going to be for the big, like not because of like the safe trade or because they want to enact some form of change, but rather because for their own pockets and for their own selfish reasons. Two, I think that the average human person probably is already like the average human person in status quo probably already doesn't have that much information to go off to begin with, right? I'll prove that more later, but I don't think that you can probably prove that like these people are going to be making really good decisions for these companies. Then they say, but what about the ability for you to like involve yourself in shareholders, right? No need, because there's already incentive to do so. And there's zero analysis of why governments have no incentive or have an incentive to be hands off anyways. That's the very simple mechanism for this. It's just a voting metric, right? I.e., the governments have the reason why governments implement things like in Singapore, for example, like labor laws, right? Or the reason why governments, for example, implement things like, for example, like anti-discrimination laws is because they know if they don't put those protections in, people will like the hell, bro, like you're not like protecting us, and then revolt. But for countries that cannot do so, it is your third world countries. Guys, like OG says slave trade. Okay, then if India right now decides, you know what, we're going to abolish all like kinds of like all the like the slave stuff, right, and all the sweatshop workers, the comparative is not no slave trade. The comparative is no jobs, guys. So I don't think the OG can claim that you're going to be the best decisions for them. Feel like the simple like case I'm going to set up for you is very like it's the simple case I'm going to set up for you is why the presumed good or increased centralization in status quo is probably a good thing. I think the reasons why shareholders are kind of shit are three reasons. One, that the average stakeholder like you and me, do not have the fullest information of these people. Therefore, they don't like make stuff, or they don't like make decisions according to, like, say for example, a good thing, according to like its best like interest, right? I.e., I think that like for example, the reason why we the reason why the most of us are really afraid of econs motions in general is precisely this, that we just read like a lot of it is just really extremely jargonized, and a lot of us just really don't know what's going on. But more than that, I think like things like, for example, trade secrets and how the company functions is also not privy to the average person. Even if they are, I don't think they can make the best decisions either. Two, I think that like it's very like if this is true, then I think the principle on gov also falls on this debate, right? That if you don't have the fullest extent of knowledge of these things, I think principally speaking, that the same way that we don't want people making decisions for people who don't go through the same lived experiences for minorities, for instance, is the same reason why we don't make like choices for companies in the first place. Third reason is that in terms of workers, right, I just don't think there's a culture of like helping workers. I'm unsure that the premise of this stems from the fact that a lot of people just really want workers' rights. In developing countries, I think this often appears out of necessity, i.e. that certain stages cannot afford to have proper labor, and if they do, they die, right? Because like they have to compete them with other countries who are perfectly okay with screwing over their kids. But more than that, I think the increase in developed countries, like for more developed countries, the reason why there's such a big pushback for like the $15 an hour like minimum wage in the US, for instance, is not just because companies are like really against it, right? But it's also because the average person on the ground is like, well, $15 an hour, I think that like this is a bit too much for the average person. I think this is a bit too much for the average human being. I think that the average sentiment of the average stakeholder probably isn't also as well to ensure this. But more than that, I think as well, like an average stakeholder also has an incentive to make things cheap. When you increase the price of these kinds of labor, the money trickles down to the cost of the consumer, right? And the average consumer that also doesn't want to do these kinds of things. No, thank you. I think the harms are few-fold. One, that I think specifically is problematic for developing countries. This is important. Because when they pull out, right, they don't pull out just one factory, yeah? They pull out entire industries and entire like stuff. We see this in like the 1980s, like export from India, right? When what happened during the trend of protectionism was that when India decided to raise its minimum wage from 80 cents to $1.10, what happened was it literally like reduced its production. Like companies just pulled out and just went to China, which was 80 cents, right, or 70 cents. I think like in terms of the standard capitalist model, you cannot ensure these kinds of things, right? But moreover, I think that this means that not only do you have no jobs, but you also have no HQs. You have no ability to then do things like R&D. I think that's pretty screwed. I think number two, you screw up a company, right? That when companies, for example, want to do these kinds of proper, like happy, like labor staff, that A, they cannot, cause there's going to be a huge pushback from the average person anyways, but B, even if like the average person really wants it, they do it in the worst way possible, right? 3, I think that there's a reduced stakeholders, like incentive for stakeholders to then participate in these companies. There's an a priori bad, because this means that companies then are unable to, let's say, do things, for example, invest in R&D when they so want to, or they don't have a bunch of funds that they can tap onto when they need to do things, for example, invest, right? I think the comparative is this. On our side of the house, we help developing countries, because I think this is the point in which that we are able to get things like, for example, money, and you need that in order for you to access other things like, for example, workers' rights, right? You cannot access workers' rights in like developing countries if you have no jobs to begin with. 2, I think that like for the average like company, right? I think in developed countries, I think that it's on our side of the house. I think we're perfectly fine. I think that like you screw over companies a lot. You don't screw over companies a lot more. I.e. that we think that like companies function like in status quo, and then that's perfectly fine, because I think that's pretty efficient anyways. But okay, let's take them at best. Even if it's true, the government like there's a principal harm, and the government should should be controlling these companies. I think that on our side, I think that like the trade-off we're willing to make is pretty simple, right? That for developed countries, you need one to access the other. You need jobs to access like your workers, right? But more than that, right? I think that the trade-off the other trade-off we're willing to make here is that if the company screws up on our side, on your side of the house, I think that's a lot worse. And makes it a lot harder for you to implement other kinds of policies versus, for example, on our side of the house. Even if it's true that, even if it's slow, even if there are things, for example, labor unions, right, that currently exist, I think that we're perfectly fine with that existing for all these reasons. Proud to be on OO.
Thank you, Leader of Opposition, for that speech. Now I'd like to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Is that unmuted?
Oh, we can go back. I don't really actually want to see that.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'll just move on.
Oh, you are. Oh, we've always been unmuted. Oh boy.
Oh no, unmuted. Oh.
Yeah, they got an extension now.
Looking forward to hearing it, guys. Hi, sorry for the wait. We're just figuring out some logistical issues. Can everyone hear me?
Yep, all good.
Status quo is a world where, quite simply, there is an incentive problem. Corporations are arbitrarily restrained by fiduciary obligations from acting in their own best interest or from acting in the best interest of the other stakeholders that represent the community, employees, and the environment. The policy of opening government is incredibly simple. All we would do is correct for the incentives that arbitrarily exist and that OO never actually defends in order to allow companies to look after their long-term interests and those of all the other stakeholders. I'm going to start this speech by addressing sort of the main thrust of opening opposition's case and what appears to be closing opposition's extension, which is just that there are other mechanisms by which we can achieve the benefits of looking after those groups. There are like alternate mechanisms of regulation, of like suing, of class actions, and so on. Why are those options not sufficient? Firstly, we would point out those options are not mutually exclusive with this policy, so that is not a reason they can get up in this debate. Secondly, we would say those regulations are often incredibly ineffective for a set of reasons. Firstly, there are things like regulatory capture that means people responsible for implementing those regulations often have the interests of the company at heart. Secondly, there's things like lobbying that means government's capacity to regulate is weakened and their incentive to do so is weakened. Thirdly, often corporations are sufficiently large and sufficiently powerful that they can win out over governments by threatening to, for example, withdraw from those jurisdictions if they're not respected. And fourthly, obviously they have things like very large legal teams But fifthly, and this is the important one, right? Often you just don't have a standing to sue. Like, how do you have a class action for the destruction of the environment if you don't live in that environment? If you don't own that property, right? You don't have the standing to sue. You have no right to sue. What if the harm is one that occurs in the long term? What if there's no environmental damage now, but it'll be unlivable in 20 or 30 years? Then how do you sue? The courts don't recognize those kinds of things, but under our model, they would, because the environment would be a stakeholder. You would have standing to sue that company on environmental grounds and say that they have a fiduciary obligation to look after the environment, and therefore they are failing an obligation that is within the company's charter that they must address. Similarly, for example, maybe you just don't have the legal right to sue. Like maybe you were being harmed as an employee when your working conditions are bad or you're being paid poorly, but as long as it's legal to do those things in that jurisdiction, there is no way you can demand higher wages. But now you can sue and say that the distribution of profits primarily to shareholders and not to employees violates the fiduciary obligations that that company has to you as an employee, that there must be that redistribution. And we grant those rights that allow for the consideration of customers, of the environment, and of employees, which obviously is far, far more effective than anything that can be proposed on op bench. I think that knocks down the main thrust of like closing opposition. Let's address some of the more specific things opening opposition says. They tell us, well, governments can regulate. I've already given 5 reasons why they will not or cannot do so effectively. But even if you thought that governments could like, do some work, obviously we additionally got more efficacy there because, for example, we changed standing and we changed the incentives and capacity of companies to act. So maybe it's a case like they claim like, well, maybe shareholders already have interest to want to look after these things. We would say maybe some long-term shareholders do want to, for example, engage in sustainable practices, knowing that it's a better long-term business model, or maybe the company's management does, but they're prevented from engaging that practice by fiduciary obligations. All it takes is one activist investor to say, your obligation is to prioritize shareholders. Why are you not prioritizing immediate profit and then taking them to court? And maybe that is a battle that the company could win in court, but they're obviously not going to want to take that risk. They're obviously not going to want to have to engage in a lengthy legal battle they might have to pay for. They might not want to take the risk of losing and engaging in constant action or statutory derivative actions or things like being sued by their shareholders. They're just going to give in and maximize shareholder profit in the short term against the interests of everyone involved. We cure that because now there's no court case, right? You get the motion dismissed immediately by saying we're paying our employees good wages because they're a stakeholder that we are legally obligated to look after. We're being sustainable in our business practices because we're legally obligated to look after the environment. Those cases never get anywhere. That harm is solved. We're much better than the status quo there. Lastly, the last sort of claim we hear is like maybe companies lack information to make these choices well, and they'll do things dumb things. Obviously not, because the interest is mutual for the corporation and the employee, right? Like both of them want, like the company also wants well-treated workers who are sustainable and don't burn out and develop their talent. They obviously don't want to pay too much money to workers and have to shut down their business. So obviously a happy middle ground can easily be found there. Like companies now have more incentive to reward employees. They don't have an incentive to give all their money to the employee and go out of business. That's bad for the company. They have to balance it still against other interests like the shareholders. Those interests still exist. They're just lessened in scale, which is why obviously you wouldn't, for example, set up a $15 minimum wage if that was going to make your business unprofitable, because neither the company would want that, nor would the employees want that. So it's unclear why the pressure for that to occur would exist. So that knocks that claim out of the debate. At this point, yes.
Litigation under the status quo is efficient because it deals with areas of the law which are unclear. Litigation under your side is inefficient because it deals with literally everything.
No, first of all, the vast majority of litigation is not on areas that are clear under the law. Presumably you wouldn't need the litigation in that point, right? Why would you have violated the law if you knew you were just going to get sued? That's dumb. It's obviously primarily things like statutory derivative actions where shareholders sue you for not engaging in your fiduciary obligations. Now you much easily dismiss those suits. Things get much better. So at the end of this part of the speech, I think I've already proven that this obviously benefits all those stakeholders significantly, right? Employees get treated better, the environment is looked after and so on, but it's also better for the company because it's more sustainable, can retain more talent, can operate more efficiently without scamming customers means you maintain long-term relationships. So there's no trade-off at this point in the debate, but let's stack on some additional content we give you. We secondly explain to you why this is principally obligated to occur, which receives no response from opening opposition. 3 reasons. Firstly, that companies have incredibly large amounts of power and you're entitled to reciprocal protection and consideration from them because they're effectively governments. The fact that the scale of impact of those corporations means that you ought be allowed to restrain them. And thirdly, the fact that the granting of things like limited liability, tax concessions, corporate personhood, the use of public resources and infrastructure all mean that you have given something to corporations and they owe a reciprocal obligation to consider you in return, and therefore it is legitimate to impose on them the obligation to consider each and every one of those stakeholders in every decision that they make, which is why this was something that was not only beneficial to everyone in the debate, it was something that was required of corporations to engage in. At the end of this speech, the benefits we gain are significant. It was things like ending the practice of slave labor because of people who existed there. And to be clear, this isn't like sweatshops as something that might need to exist out of necessity. This was things like not paying people at all in the first place, which occurs in the chocolate industry because they are now a stakeholder. You can now be sued for engaging in that action when otherwise you could not. It was things like treating your workers well. It was things like not scamming your customers. It was things like not deforesting, like overfishing or bulldozing the Amazon. Incredibly proud to govern.
Thank you, DPM, for that speech. Now I'd like to welcome DLO to close off the opening half. Here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yep, all good.
I'm going to do three things in this speech. Firstly, deal with, is this policy necessary? Secondly, does this policy work? And then lastly, how companies are going to react to this imposition on them and what they're likely to do with this reaction. Things that Waiter already started premises on, we didn't hear any engagement with these ideas. Before that, I just want to point out something really quickly, because a large part of OG's case is, do corporations have reciprocal duty? Yes, they do. No shit, Sherlock. Obviously, companies have like some sort of reciprocal duty to society. That's possibly true. The question of this debate is whether or not this imposition of a constitutional change achieves that reciprocal duty in the best way possible. There was no mechanistic link in OG for why this was the method that states needed to impose this reciprocal duty on companies on. That is something that automatically throws OG out of this debate. So let's deal with, is this necessary to continue this analysis, right? Because as was implied in the POI from CO, that there are multiple alternatives to be able to engage this, right? Yes, class action lawsuits is one of them. The response that they get from OG is to say, but corporations are so powerful. There are lobbies, there are big legal teams, there are corporate capture, which means that all of these other means don't work. The first thing I want to say is that there are a bunch of other things beyond class action lawsuit, right? Like media scrutiny, strikes, boycotts of companies, minimum wage laws, labor standards, protests, whatever it is. There are a range of possibilities and alternatives that are not just legal in nature in order to push companies into this action to change. But secondly, to point out is that debate land equal fiat in both worlds. Like, you cannot say we got political capital to impose upon the constitutions of all of these large companies, but we don't have the exact same political capital to impose, I don't know, minimum wage laws, labor standards. Like, surely if you had the political capital to impose something on all of the major corporations in your debate, we would suggest an opposition, you are better off using that political capital in more direct ways, as opposed to ways that are like imposed on constitution and then hopefully the courts take care of everything else. That's just not a useful way of using the political capital that you have in this debate. So surely this imposition on constitution is just not a necessary outcome. But before we go into whether or not it works, assuming that's necessary, I'll take Amrit's POI.
So if it's true that you want to use your capital to do things like labor regulations and environmental regulations, wouldn't you have all the harms your LO says that companies will just leave? So which one is it? Do you care about the harms or do you want to use your capital for this?
Yeah, the difference is that the imposition isn't on equal balance of all the stakeholders at exactly the same time, but one that says there is this minimum bar you have to meet in order to be fair to the citizens of my country. That's the difference, right? Because in government's world, you have to impose a world where every single stakeholder is equally treated and there is no prioritization of one over the other. It's in our world where we can say, no, we don't give a shit about anyone else. We care about our citizens and the protection of their minimum wage and their labor standards. And if that means you have to exploit something else, if that means you have to deprioritize your shareholders, if that means you have to deprioritize maybe the environment, we think that that is an okay trade-off because there are some things that are more important than others. Therefore, companies still can make profit. Companies still have an incentive to come into my area. Companies still have an incentive to want to invest in me because some things are worth trading off. It's in Gov's world where they don't allow trade-off because remember, no prioritization of any stakeholder. So does this work? Let's do three things here. The first thing is to point out this like inconsistent characterization in OG, right? Because on one hand, companies are ruthless, they are entitled, they don't balance commercial interests in the most effective way, they're really, really bad and they're evil and they only care about shareholders. But at the same time, like, because the constitution gets edited in their world, now suddenly these companies are going to like wake up like Clark Kent becoming Superman, and then suddenly balance everything perfectly. Now these companies suddenly care about well-balanced commercial interests, that they will care about well-treated employees because it's good for them. They will care about sustainability because it's good for their profit margin. Like, what is the characterization of these companies, right? Are they evil and don't give a shit about the environment, and then this constitution is supposed to help them do that? Or are they companies that really care about this balance? Because if these are companies that really care about this balance, then like, your policy useless, right? These companies will do it anyway. They will get to the point where they care about sustainability anyway. They will care about well-treated employees anyway. Like, just the weird characterization that assumes the changing of a constitution suddenly like wakes companies up to do better, right? But the second thing is that the solution in their world is that the most vulnerable, most ostracized people still need to sue the company before it's effective. So all of Udai's analysis about how there are large legal teams, there's this like lobby power against the government, they have the ability to influence society, and these are large corporations that are ruthless, means that your average minimum wage employee still gets no benefit from this policy, right? Because your average like $12 an hour person is not going to take on the like Goliath of your legal team in this company in order to sue them because they are not following their fiduciary duty, right? It's just not feasible that you actually create the changes in your world. What is likely to happen instead is that yes, this policy allows for vulnerable people to sue for prioritizing the shareholders, but it also allows shareholders to sue for prioritizing the community, right? More likely than not, this forbidding of the prioritization that exists as a clause results in your rich, profit-motivated shareholders suing the company because this company decided to prioritize the environment or prioritize the community over their profit margins. The rich, profit-motivated people are more likely to sue the company than your average like $15 an hour wage worker. That ends up in stupid tokenistic shit by the companies, right? I have proven I cared about my employees by providing beanbag chairs in the office. Like, stupid things that just don't actually prove or meet the minimum bar because they prioritize the group of people that are more likely to sue them than the group that are less likely to sue them. We think that results in just no change at best. At worst, it results in harms towards the more vulnerable sections of society. But lastly, we told you that corporations are likely to react negatively, and this is particularly pernicious in more developing communities and in countries where these large MNCs are important to the economy, right? The incentives to invest go to like evolve in a world where you have to prioritize the rural communities, prioritize the environment and the local suppliers. Like, when you have all these priorities, you're not going to go into more like new areas or riskier ventures or more rural environments because it's significantly riskier to balance out having to prioritize the community and the environment in those areas as opposed to prioritizing your shareholder. That means that most companies are not going to invest in countries or regions that allow for good economic investment in the area. As OG pointed out, that these countries need the like gap filling of these companies. It's unclear why the lack of these companies coming in is beneficial in their world. We oppose.
Thank you, Diallo, for that speech, and that concludes the opening half. Stop recording, yeah? So for the member of government.
It's still recording, yeah.
Yeah. Wait, I just don't know where Matthew is. Could you stop recording, Matthew? The member of opposition. Here.
Hey, can I be heard?
Yep, all good.
government teams in this debate say, well, there are so many interests in this world. Why should we prioritize shareholders? And OO fails to answer this, which is why they don't have the debate. But realistically, we will answer this question, and that is the crux of our extension, which is the reason why shareholders are important is because the wishes of shareholders align with short-run profit incentives. And profit incentives are not intrinsically the most important thing in this debate, but they're mechanisms which are very simple and easy to cater for. Because when you have a company that just runs on a simple profit incentive, the way that you plug in any policy or any expectation is you go X profit incentive plus Y policy equals Z outcome. Their side expands and muddles the inputs because they have X profit incentive plus Y community plus Z environment plus A workers, sigma, alpha, whatever. And it becomes very difficult to predict the outcomes and very hard to curate your inputs. That's why good technocratic organizations such as the Reserve Bank use very simple metrics, such as an inflation rates, or why prisons use simple metrics like the recidivism rate, because it's easy to design systems that cater and capture those incentives. What their side does, firstly, is that they destroy the efficacy entirely of government regulation and intervention, because government regulation and intervention entirely revolves around the ability to control for a profit mechanism, to create systems which capture profit incentives. Firstly, through safety regulations that attract the financial sanction of fines which companies cares about. Secondly, for instance, through the environment by pricing in carbon or using ETS systems to make companies scared of doing those things. And thirdly, through inputting things like subsidies and like maternity benefits that increase the employment of women. You're very easily able to control for the reactions and the outputs of companies through the profit mechanism. And it's very easy to create policy that way. That is the beauty of capitalist governments, because while they're imperfect, as Jordyn describes, they have better standards, they have better regulations, they have better structures than literally any other system in the world. And this has three very important harms. Firstly, it makes it far harder for government to introduce any effective policy because it's so unclear and so hard to predict what exactly is the outcome of your policy. In the status quo, if you tax a company by 10% for polluting in a certain way, you know they'll probably just reduce their emissions by 10% in response, or they'll do some other thing like some other instance that you can cater for, but we have no idea what the fuck happens on their side, because their side is like, oh, you have to care about these stakeholders and that stakeholders, who knows what goes in that board. But secondly, you take away the imperative to do this policy entirely, because now governments and legislatures are like, well, these interests are already provided for, so you don't need to do this. It defers responsibility from the government onto individual litigants. And lastly, governments literally find it impossible to interfere because their side creates a whole stack of legal precedent about what should be done in certain situations. And governments literally cannot regulate because most democratic systems have a separation of powers, which means that the legislature literally have their hands tied behind their backs when the courts already said, well, in this instance, we'll allow the oil spill because you actually earn more money and we're balancing the interest. The government literally cannot do anything on their side. And this doesn't just apply to government policy. The unpredictability of this applies to other actors. Firstly, it looks like unions that rely on the ability to withhold labor and profit. It looks like activists like CG talks about in their ability to boycott certain companies and reduce their profit margin. It looks like in the economy, investments become far riskier because the less clear trajectories and the less clear motivations of companies means that there is far more risk attached to investing to these companies, which means that they get far more economic volatility on their side of the debate. But it also crux media scrutiny because the media is able to capture the incentives of companies in the status quo and look well, they have a clear profit incentive, they're polluting the environment, we can report on this, but we have no idea what the incentives of companies are now because they're so obscure and complicated, and literally no one on the government team gives us a concrete answer of how those incentives are described. They're just like, well, it's a balance. What is the balance? We don't understand this balance. And this is far more effective than their model of litigation for two reasons. Firstly, litigation is far, far, far less accessible than regulation because their model requires individuals overcoming barriers such as collective action problems, such as wealth barriers, to actually get the money together to litigate a company, to go in court and be like, well, the balance hasn't been struck quite well, all that kind of stuff, which is not only super efficient for society because you have all these court cases opening up, but is also super expensive. Contrast this to our side, where even the poorest person can access the mechanism of democracy. They can access voting and governments can regulate on that basis. But secondly, litigation only happens on our side in cases of inefficiency, which is say in the 90% instance of oil spills, governments are able to use existing regulation and be like, well, you just get fined now and deter that. And only the 10% of gray area oil spills are the ones that actually go to court and attract the inefficiency of litigation. But on their side, every single time there is any environmental problem in question, they're subjected to the delay and the bureaucracy of the court. Their system is one that stops stops and stands at a standstill and does nothing while the environment burns down because they literally can't decide things in time, and the government has their hands tied behind their back because they've taken away the key tools of the government to actually provide for the welfare of their people. There's two very important impacts for this. Firstly, we actually provide for the incentives that OG talked about, but we provide it in a cleaner way, and they're provided by far more altruistic actor. Because what does a company balancing interest actually looks like? We have no idea. No one's given a clear picture on the government, but governments are really experienced in balancing different stakeholder interests because they do that through the political mandate, because different interest groups in society vote in certain ways and governments can aggregate and separate interests in that way. But secondly, we prove that regulation is actually mutually exclusive to this model because their side, it destroys the efficacy of regulation because you can no longer have that regulation. And that means OG can't just claim, well, we can have the regulation too. They literally cannot support regulation on their side. It becomes mute and ineffective. I'll take a point from closing.
If you want to run an entire extension on regulation, would you care to respond to all of our analysis about why regulation is particularly ineffective in a lot
All
of
right,
cases?
political capital. The first thing to say is that they get rid of regulation entirely, which is probably more of a harm on their side. Secondly, in terms of political capital, the thing with corporate capture, it's a really smart mechanism, but corporate capture has its limits because of the fact that the way that corporate capture is effective is when companies lobby governments. They do this through money, and the governments use this money to buy votes. So because the final outcome still rests on the ability of voters to vote, and corporate capture slightly just skews that because they just pay money so certain parties can actually convince more voters. That is the way their mechanism works, but it doesn't totally override the will of the people. Our case isn't that, the status quo of regulation is perfect, because it's not perfect, but it does a damn good way of capturing the different incentive society, and it does it in a clean way. Their side destroys this entirely because governments literally cannot regulate at all. They don't know what to do, and they rely on companies to balance interests in such an anomalous way that government teams have never truly described in this debate. And for these reasons, we're very, very proud to oppose.
Thank you, member of opposition, for that speech. Recording again. Here.
There's nothing there.
All right, can be heard?
Yep.
Hi. Fellows, it's a rare point in time where I've actually had to defend David. So the first thing I'm going to start with is explain why our extension wins debate, because I think the response from Amrit was incredibly disingenuous. The first thing to establish about why we win the debate is top half broadly focuses only on the effects of this policy on individual corporations and the stakeholders associated with it. OG tells you this corporation in and of itself might get better. OO says corporations go out of business and this could screw over the developing country. Look at the extension we tell you from CO, where we explain the broader macro impacts and how it interacts with society and all the government regulation which is going to surround it. And obviously that was going to be far more important than necessarily motivating one individual company to behave in a certain way. Let's see what David tells you. David tells you very clearly that the reason why the gov model does not work is because it is incredibly hard to predict outcomes when you have to balance so many competing incentives. That was particularly hard. We had to consider, how does this interact with the environment? How does it interact with the shareholders? How does it interact with the consumers? And such unpredictability will always yield different outcomes. And the harm of that is that it makes it infinitely harder to regulate. And that was the thing they had to deal with here. Obviously,
And the harder it is to regulate, the harder it is to prevent the most pernicious of corporate behaviors. It makes investment harder. AllBirds' argument is that regulation is super complex as well. You don't really get anything there. But the point here is that AllBirds misses the actual mechanism here, which is that we talk about why predictability makes it better. Also, I'll just contest that regulation is not actually that complex. That like regulation is long, there's lots of it, but the outcomes it produces are definite and clear. If there was an oil spill, you're probably going to get fined. If you don't pay your workers above minimum wage, you're probably going to get cooked too. Like if you do not follow such regulations, the outcome is clearly defined. Compared to litigation in of itself, you do not know the outcome when you litigate something. The reason why you litigate is because it is unclear and because there is a competing interest in an adversarial system where the outcomes can be debated between each other. If it was clear, you just get a settlement, settlement outside of courts. That is why we tell you regulation was going to be far more better. Notably here, I think you also do not contend with why regulation can actually be effective, because Dom's main push here. So I'll respond to Dom now. So please have been mean to us afterwards. But Dom's main point here is just that the problem with regulation is that there are loopholes. There's like corporate capture. You don't have political capital here, and really it's just government does it badly. But that's just the argument against like all forms of regulation. Obviously, it is not perfect, but David explained to you why regulation is broadly going to be undercut by US policy and why it gets far, far, far more worse on their side of the house. Not really on our side of the house. The first thing to establish that obviously we can get some regulation because their policy was going to use so much political capital to implement. Because obviously, firstly, you are intruding upon a corporation's right to behave in the way they want to. Secondly, you have to also overcome corporations' lobbying power. So for them to have the fiat power to introduce that, we probably also have the fiat power to introduce relatively good regulation. And what that looks like is that regulation tackles problems in and of itself. It is more neat and elegant for the reason that if you want to do environmental protection, you prevent the company from being able to mine in this area. If you want to make them change their behavior, you put in regulation like carbon taxes so they internalize externalities and change their behavior to care about the environment. If you want them to have better labor laws, you just get them to have better labor laws and pay the people the right amount of money, right? Such regulation is not complex and we can get it under our side of the house and that was going to be beneficial. Notably, David also explains why this is far more effective than the litigation mechanism because we tell you we can set minimum standards that you cannot breach in any circumstance. And secondly, you can also cap behavior so there's the absolute of what you can do, like that you can produce. That was going to be far, far, far more better here. But no, here, let me talk about why, if we had to make a trade-off this way, why we ought prefer having more government regulation than having the right to be able to sue and having more open standing here. The reason why we ought accept the trade-off is because first, no, this obviously distinguishes us from our openings. Our openings is like regulation, sick. We're like, no, but we'll take the trade-off here. So the first thing to establish is that David already tells you litigation is incredibly inefficient. The second thing here is to also tell you that the right to sue requires a lot of momentum from ground up, which is unable to be achieved. For example, to be able to sue, you need to overcome things like wealth and income effects. You need to overcome things like collective action problem. You need to have some altruistic person to fund you in the first place. And that isn't even to say that there is going to be a bunch of corporations with all the really, really good lawyers to prevent you from being able to sue. But the most important mechanism which you miss here is that this policy creates a whole new body of law and whole new body of liability, which therefore means the outcomes are far less predictable. That means it's going to take years and years and years to develop the case law for you to litigate things in a proper manner and to know what outcomes. During that time, people are being hurt. You're not doing any regulation to protect these people. It also makes decisions far less predictable. So even if you can sue, it's unlikely you get the good outcomes in the first place anyway. And that is why it was going to be a far, far, far worse outcome there.
Sure. Your opening explains regulation is about minimum standards. Our policy is about requiring more than the minimum, paying above minimum wage rather than distributing profits to shareholders. Obviously, you could still enforce regulation like finding executives for someone. I don't know why this is mutually exclusive.
David already told you why it's mutually exclusive. In that it tells you that when you have to look at all these competing interests, it is far harder to be able to regulate in a way which actually gets you better outcomes. So maybe everyone gets the absolute base minimum standards, right? We're able to get more regulation on top, which is more targeted. Your side still requires a litigation mechanism, and you never actually proved it was going to be effective and it was going to be useful there. Also, the last thing to be said here is that the law also does not always go in the right way. So, for example, a corporation could win out against some like nice environmental activists banding together, and the problem with that here is that unlike legislation which can be overturned by successive governments, the law is far more harder to overturn because you need to go through so many courts of appeal. You need to take things from the federal Supreme Court to the federal court to the High Court, and as a result, because High Court judges also tend to be more conservative, it is far harder to overturn bad decision, and it locks people in situations where you have absolutely no momentum, and you're likely to have some, it's likely to be. Yeah, it's going to be inertia there. As a result, that was going to be bad. Also, lastly, on like developing countries, I just think this whole kind of area is likely to be unimpactful, right? For a few reasons. The first of which is just that it is also the least likely people to be able to access to a mechanism for change in the first place, because firstly, in developing countries, there are already incredibly weak judicial systems. There are already poor systems of arbitration, which therefore means it's incredibly unlikely that you're going to be able to litigate things in a way which was not captured by corporate interests as well. The second thing here is that these people are also the ones to be least privileged and least likely to be able to litigate in an effective manner to be able to overcome such things, which therefore means, look, the developing world probably gets screwed under both sides, but under our world, David also additionally explains to you why regulation is still likely to be the better outcome. Because firstly, we tell you, that regulation is it's mutually exclusive because it's mutually exclusive. But also, secondly, the fact that it is also more accessible because it does not require capital to get change. It just requires you voting in the right government and voting and exercising kind of your democratic powers to be able to signal to the government what you want as the people. But also importantly, Dom tells us, well, political capture occurs, and it's like, yes, it is true. Political capture is likely to occur, but the reason why we're able to cop this hard and why it's still better than their world in any instance is because it can never fully override democratic will. You get money, you put it back into people, maybe you like suck up some corporations a little bit, but you can still get regulation and still hold them accountable there, and there is a political will to do so. That's why I'm incredibly proud to oppose.
Thank you, Opposition Whip, for that speech, and thank you everyone for that wonderful debate. I think the judges will just deliberate here, and then we'll announce it in the main hall. So yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you.